I want to introduce for you the panel, and we will then get started. And I'm going to begin with Donald Parry at the end. Now, Dr. Parry, is, or do I call you Professor Parry? What would be the preferential?
Don is fine. I'm a professor. I'm a full professor.
He is a full professor of Hebrew Bible in the Department of Asian and Near Eastern Languages at Brigham Young University. His expertise is not just in the Hebrew Bible, but also in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And we'll be talking about those during the panel. He has been working on or with the scrolls for 30 years now. I met him just on this visit, but I've known of him from a dear friend, a mutual friend of all of ours, who passed away 2 years ago, and that's Weston Fields. And Weston had been singing your praises for many years and saying that I needed to meet you. So it's an honor to have you here. By my count, not mine, by my reading, you have 33 books, 10 of which pertain to the Dead Sea Scrolls. 5 deal with the writings of Isaiah. He's published, of course, articles and things like that. And so he and his wife, Camille, have 6 children. And is this your first trip to Houston?
No, my first trip here.
It's your first trip here?
This library. But
would you join me in giving him a This Library Texas welcome? And then seated next to me is Bill Schniedewind. Now, Bill has been a friend of mine for a few decades. We don't have as much time with each other as we'd like. But early in our relationship, when this chapel was being painted, I had set up the painting, and you have in this second crossover the story of the Exodus. And it concludes with Moses there signaling to the Israelites, go that way, across the Rift Valley. But you will see up here, Moses is holding the 10 Commandments. And I told my painter that I did not want those painted in the text that you might read in a Hebrew Bible today. The Hebrew Bible text that we typically read from is actually an Aramaic script, an alphabet, which the Jews adopted probably during the Babylonian captivity at some point. But it is not what the Paleo-Hebrew script would have looked like if you're a late Exodus guy like me in the 13th century BC. In the 1200s, we don't know really what it would look like, but I wanted to come closer. So I told my painter, just wait. My painter had finished everything except the 10 Commandments. And he sent me an email saying, that's all I have left to do. Give me what I must do, or I'm going home. I was in Scotland at the time. And I took that email and I emailed Bill Schniedewind and 3 or 4 other friends that I had who were conversant with ancient Hebrew and other languages. And I asked them, Bill, what script should we use? And all of them weighed in. But I think ultimately Bill was the one responsible for the script that we used. Then all I had to do is figure out how to manipulate that script into something my painter could paint. But Bill is professor of biblical studies in Northwest Semitic languages. He's the chair of the Ancient Eastern Mediterranean Studies at the University of California at LA, UCLA. He took his bachelor's degree from George Fox, his master's in historical geography of Israel from Jerusalem University College. He also has a master's and a PhD in Near Eastern Studies from Brandeis in Boston. He's intimately involved in the study of the scrolls of Second Temple Judaism. He is the trustee and a secretary for the Albright Institute. He's written a number of books. A lot of y'all have probably worked through his primer on Ugaritic. I will tell you how the Bible became a book was published by Cambridge in 2004, And it just took him 20 years to do the follow-up about the story of the scribes and how they physically wrote the Bible. I heard him lecture on that at Lipscomb University, my alma mater, a couple of weeks ago. And it's a really, really good lecture that I'd love to have him come back here and do again here at some point in time. But would you join me in welcoming Bill Schniedewind? And our feature, the center of the table, is Emeritus Professor of Bible Studies at Hebrew University, Emanuel Tove. Now, Emanuel and his wife Lika have done, is this your third sabbatical here? Third or fourth? You've been here
4 times.
4 times. They've been, I can't tell you which of these houses they're living in because I don't trust you not to just go knock on the door and talk to him. But I will tell you that he and his wonderful wife, Lika, who is an artist extraordinaire, who has paintings that she has given us that are hanging in various places in our buildings, but also an exhibit on display in the library. He is a friend, and he has been a wonderful friend for 15 years, I guess. As a youth, he studied classical languages in Holland at the Spinoza Lyceum. His bachelor's degree is in Bible and Greek literature from Hebrew University. He has a master's in Hebrew Bible. He at Harvard University studied with Frank Moore Cross, who, if he had still been alive, would have been on my email chain about what script should we use, because he is the father of such things in a way. His PhD is from Hebrew University in Jerusalem, where he worked with Shemarayu Talmud, who is like impressive. Visiting professor at the University of Oxford, Uppsala, Sydney, Stellenbosch, University of Pennsylvania. Since the early 1990s, he's been intimately connected with the Dead Sea Scrolls from 1990 to 2009. So for almost 20 years, he was the editor-in-chief of the International Dead Sea Scrolls Publication Project. And we've got, there are 33 volumes, I think, at this point, but those are spectacular. He's done a lot of other things as well. He has awards beyond the ability to spend time on talking. He has 3 children, 4 grandchildren. Would you give a Texas welcome again to Professor Tove? Now, gentlemen, I'd like to introduce to you the audience. We have here a bunch of kids from school. What is the name of your school? And what grades are you in? You've got a bunch of 10th graders over there that have come in. Okay, so this is part of our audience. Have any of y'all published in peer-reviewed literature on the Dead Sea Scrolls? So they are part of our audience. Part of our audience, as I look out here, includes scholars. We've got professors from Baylor. We've got professors from Trinity Evangelical. We've got professors from all over the place. But we also have a bunch of people who are just patrons of the library. We've got a bunch of people that go to my Sunday school class. So we've got a wide assortment of people here. And that means we can go deep, but we want to start where everyone's on the same ground. So here's where we begin. Which one of you would like to give a short 3-minute history of what the Dead Sea Scrolls are, and then we will define what we're going to be talking about. But somebody explain the historical significance of these discoveries in the Judean desert.
Okay. It's all, where's the map? We took care of a beautiful map, and the map will be on in a few minutes. in the year 1947, historical documents unheard of were completely by coincidence were found were found in a completely unexpected place in well, it's called a desert, but it's not really a desert. These are caves in an arid area near the Dead Sea, not in the Dead Sea, but near the Dead Sea. These are remnants of the literature, of the literary remains of a group of Jewish people. In the beginning, they were portrayed as Christian literature. That took some 10, 20 years until it was clear, it was clarified. This is really Jewish literature. From the time of Jesus Christ, that's true, but it is Jewish literature. The map is on, and I'll show in a while. Jewish literature from the time written between, you should remember the time, written between 250 before the Common Era, that's before Christ, until the 1st century, and in some cases the 2nd century of the Common Era, that is after Christ. And they were found in different places, and the main site, the main place is called Qumran, and it's there, but not here. The main place is called Qumran. When you use the term Dead Sea Scrolls, you mainly think about Qumran. That's where these caves are. And in Qumran, near the Dead Sea, lived a community of about 400 people. They're called a group. Sometimes we call them a sect that separated itself from the main group of the Jews living elsewhere in the country. They devoted themselves to praying to God, to tilling the land, and to writing, to praying and to writing literature, writing religious literature. At the same time, they also were copying, and I'll be talking about that tomorrow in my lecture at 7 o'clock tomorrow night. They copied and they copied and they copied. So these are remnants of the literature of the Jewish people from that period. Much literature was brought into Qumran, that they brought there. And so through these Dead Sea Scrolls, we have an impression of the literature of that period. Now, there are also 2 other sites, or 3 or 4 other sites south of Qumran. When the map is up, I'll show them later on. And the most famous place of that is the top of the Masada mountain. And these are different types of communities. We'll talk about them later on when the map is on the screen.
Okay. So prior to this discovery, and maybe we can categorize the texts that were discovered into 2 big buckets. One bucket being the biblical texts, and the other bucket being other Jewish writings that were not what we would consider to be biblical texts. But prior to this discovery, if we wanted to see the oldest copy of the Tanakh, of the Hebrew, the bulk of the Hebrew Bible, what Christians would call the Old Testament, how old would that copy have been?
Well, the oldest copy that we know about before the discovery of the Dead Sea scrolls of a biblical text is essentially around 1000 CE or AD 1000. So the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls essentially pushed back the earliest biblical manuscripts at more than 1,000 years. And generally speaking, people would also say that there's a certain kind of continuity between the Masoretic text that we know from the early medieval period and a lot of the biblical manuscripts at Qumran, although it also complicates our understanding of the biblical text at Qumran, as Professor Parry and Professor Tove have shown.
Okay, so let's go back to basics. We have copies of the biblical texts that date from 1000 of this era, so that's 1000 AD, or if you want to say CE in the current era, maybe 900. You can go back a little bit closer to the time of Jesus, but you've got those sets of texts that have been produced historically by scholars that we call Masoretes. It's called a Masoretic text. Is that fair to say? And so you've now got, in addition to the Masoretic text, which is what has endured through the Middle Ages, you can go back 1,000 years and you can see this body of biblical text, some just fragments, some stunningly complete books. The great Isaiah scroll may be the most famous of those, but you've got these texts that are copies that had been made of the holy writings that go back over 1,000 years earlier. So it's a profound thing. Now, I would love for y'all to give us a little more background information before we get into the nitty-gritty, so these kids can answer this on their test when they get back. What can you tell us about the physical, and Donald, maybe we go to you, what can you tell us about the physical aspects of these texts? I'm thinking the materials, where the materials came from. Just give us an idea physically of what we're dealing with.
The great majority of the scrolls were written on leather, and it had to be clean leather according to the rules, which meant sheep or deer. Now you'll find a Torah scroll written on bovine or cow. And just as a little side note, I recently purchased a 100-year-old Torah scroll from Jerusalem, and it's just beautiful. I carefully show my students, and I tell them how to care for the scriptures. So 90% or so on leather, several on papyrus, and one on copper. And the copper scroll is a delightful, interesting, fascinating scroll. I think it was discovered around 1952-ish in Cave 3 of Qumran. But it's an important scroll because it's like a treasure map. And it lists 64 deposits of huge treasures. And the scroll was so brittle, and when they discovered it, it took about 6 or 8 years to learn how to cut it. And they actually took it to Manchester, England. And as I recall, a dentist cut it carefully with some kind of a saw. So, but 64 deposits of a huge treasure. Now, just one more note on the copper scroll. A lot of scholars have discussed, is it really a treasure map? Does it list the 64 deposits of treasure scattered throughout ancient Palestine? And I attended a conference in 1998 in Manchester, England, the same city where this was carefully cut up. And our moderator was George Brooke. We all know George. He asked all the scholars, is it genuine or is it fake? Genuine or fake? Because the deposits of treasure were so huge. It'd be billions of dollars worth of gold and silver and the rest. And as I recall, every scholar said it's genuine because they probably wouldn't have put a forgery on a metal, a copper metal. If you're going to do a forgery, use cheap material like papyrus. So number 1 is leather, number 2 is papyrus, and then the copper scroll.
Yeah, it's interesting, and Professor Tove, I'm going to come back to you because I want to ask you about that, but I'll throw this in as the segue. And I have to be real careful here. I'm a lawyer, okay? I mean, so this isn't like my area, okay? So I'm doing the best I can. So if these guys, don't hesitate to correct me if I say something wrong. I don't think I'm saying something wrong, but if I am, just say, Lanier, you're wrong. In the first century, a lot of the Jewish population would use the temple itself as a bank. They could put their deposits there. In essence, the temple would hold a lot of treasure, and there would be periods of time where the priests and others might even take some of that and go hide it. And I think the caves were an effective place where some thought they might have gone to hide stuff. It's part of why the Romans wanted to plunder the temple and take away as much booty as they could. It was also a reason why they disassembled the temple, because they were convinced a lot of things were hidden in rooms that they couldn't readily identify. But you've got the question of not only the copper scroll and whether or not those resources were accurate, but you've got the question of why on earth anybody's been sticking this stuff in caves anyway. And so it brings in part the geographical question of where are these caves in terms of Jerusalem. You know, help us understand where these discoveries have been made. So, Professor, you've got the pointer. Just don't fall off of this.
Yes. So what I'm going to say pertains to not only Qumran, but also to the other sides. So on top of the map, you see Qumran. And a little to the left, you have Jerusalem. So think about modern Israel. You are in Jerusalem, and you take a car, and you drive to Qumran. Takes you nowadays, it's not like 50 years ago, but it takes you nowadays half an hour, not more. And in half an hour, you're in Qumran. You descend 1,200 meters, as much as that. And you are in a kind of basin. You are 400 meters below the level of the Mediterranean Sea. And so this is an enormous difference. You are in a completely different climate. This is completely dry and arid as compared with Jerusalem and the remainder of the country. And this is the secret for the preservation of the Dead Sea Scrolls, because it's dry and arid, there's no rain there, and there's caves. So scrolls that were deposited in caves were there to stay for 2,000 years, and I can tell you a secret, that scrolls that stayed there for 2,000 years were kept in better condition for 2,000 years than when they were moved afterwards to a museum and were shown to the public for 20 years, and then they were starting processes of decay. And so in some cases, like the Isaiah scroll, it had to be moved to a vault. So they were better off in the caves. Now, the caves of Qumran, that's over there, and that's where the Qumran community lives. And when we say Dead Sea Scrolls, we basically refer to the Qumran scrolls. But in fact, when we say Dead Sea Scrolls, we should refer to all the scrolls on the left side of the Dead Sea. Because in all those sites means archaeological sites, scrolls were found. Now, what's the difference? In Qumran, these are scrolls made of skins, sometimes called leather, but they're on skins. And in all the other sites, it's mostly on papyrus. And another difference, in Qumran, they are mostly literary material, because that was a community that was highly intellectual. They wrote compositions, mostly religious, while in the other sites, like you see here the name Masada, well, but you see Murabat in the middle. These were government documents. There's Nahal Chever that you don't see there, but alongside the shores. These other sites were and together with Masada, where you have what we call documentary texts. That is a letter, that is a sale of land, that's a contract between people, it's a list, a grocery list, and there are several hundreds of them. And they're written in Aramaic, that's a language close to Hebrew, and a little in Greek, and a little bit in Hebrew, but mostly in Aramaic and in Greek, while the material of the Dead Sea Scrolls in Qumran is almost all in Hebrew, but some also in Aramaic and tiny bit in Greek. So these are major differences between different communities. There were different communities in Qumran and on the shores, on the left shores. So there would be the west shore of the Dead Sea. That's in general terms.
That is great. Well, so Bill, would you talk to us, please, about let's look especially at Qumran for a moment. Would you tell us all about what we can reasonably deduce about the community that produced these texts?
We generally think that the community, the sectarian community at Qumran, is related to a movement called the Essene movement. And it used to be that this sect was associated strictly with the site of Qumran, which would be very interesting for the history of Judaism, because then it would mean that when the site of Qumran was destroyed, like the Essenes would have also disappeared. There are a few problems with that idea from the beginning, which is one, for example, one of the scrolls from Qumran is called the Damascus document. It's actually 2 copies that were found in the Cairo Geniza, dating to around 1000 CE or AD 1000. So there's a continuity of a major composition that's related to this sectarian community that we know in many, many copies from Cave 4 at Qumran, and as well as Cave 5 elsewhere. But more than that, in recent studies, we've begun to realize, especially because of the complexity of the manuscript traditions, that actually these scrolls were copied in more places than Qumran. That's what I would say. And that the Essene movement was much more complex than a single place. So while Qumran is a major site of this sectarian community, it is not the only place where you could find an Essene, and there's a complexity to this Essene movement. The other thing I probably would say is it's really important to recognize that this is a sectarian community. You can't look at the scrolls from Qumran in Qumran scribal practice, for example, and say that this is just general Jewish community. No, this is a community that distinguishes itself in many significant ways. I'll just give 2 really significant ways. I mean, there's the scribal practice that Professor Tove has shown, but there's, so if you're not celebrating the same calendar, then you're not part of the same community, right? If it's Christmas or it's Hanukkah and we're celebrating these holidays at a different time, we're not part of the same community. As a matter of fact, that sort of plays itself out in a famous passage from the Pesher Habakkuk, when the high priest, or the wicked priest as they call him, comes down to disrupt the celebration, probably, I think, at the site of Qumran, of the Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. So that means that they're celebrating a different calendar. There are separate groups. So there's a minority of people who would probably say, no, they're not Essenes and they're not a sectarian group. But I think that is a theory that won't last, and I think is on its way out.
All right, you can hold this now. I got a newbie. Do you all agree Essene community produces the bulk of what we've got in Qumran?
Totally.
Totally. He says yes. He says yes. What say you, Mr. Dead Sea Scroll?
Say that again.
Do you believe that the Essene community produced the bulk of the materials that we have in Qumran?
In my view, if I look at the totality of what we found in Qumran, that is some 950 fragmentary scrolls, the Essene community produced 1/3, and the remainder was imported into Qumran. When I see in my frame of mind, in my dreams, I see people coming into Qumran, which is a strange place in the middle of the desert. I see people coming in there in about 100 before the Common Era. They decided to leave society, and they wanted to devote themselves to life for God, and they took with them, they didn't come with a car, they took with them a donkey, or who knows, a camel, and they took what little they have, maybe a tunic, a robe, and some scrolls, all their intellectual property. And so they took scrolls with them, and it's very interesting to see which scrolls. Now, I have a certain theory to which Bill referred. I call this the Qumran Scribal School. It's too detailed and too technical to explain, but basically it is a theory that is based on a certain scribal system. That is how you spell certain words. Let's say you have the English word night, let's say the English word color, C-O-C-C-O-L-O-U-R, which in America you spell C-O-L-O-R. So here you have a spelling difference. So you can spell Hebrew words in different ways. And so they spelled Hebrew words in different ways. They have different forms. They have different scribal systems for writing the name of God, etc., etc. So I identify certain scrolls belonging to this system. This is my theory, which many accepted and some did not accept. That's the way of scholarship. Take it or leave it. So,
if I could just add, to what Professor Tove said and kind of nuance what you said earlier. You talked about two buckets, a biblical text and Jewish text from Qumran. I wouldn't do that. I would make three buckets. I would say there's biblical texts, there's general Jewish literature that we knew about, things like the book of Tobit or Ben Sira, that were essentially existed. Then there's a whole new segment of literature that is sectarian literature, compositions of this sect that are brand new, like the War Scroll or the Community Rule or the Pesher literature from Qumran. And that's totally different. Of course, then when you get to the biblical scrolls, some of those are Essene copies and some of those are non-Essene copies. So it's a very complicated picture, but I would say we need at least three buckets.
Or yeah, or one bucket can have 2 dividers.
Let me complete this. So, by whatever criterion you use, there is an element of texts, a group of texts that was composed by and or copied by the Qumran community, and there was an element that was imported into Qumran. I think scholars probably accept this kind of division, different from what people thought in 1950 and 1960. That's why the very famous book of my teacher, Frank Moorcross, was named. He wrote this book, which was the Bible for all of us, named the Library, Ancient Library of Qumran, ALQ. Well, it's not the Ancient Library of Qumran. It may not have been a library at all. Because I say these scrolls, we call them the Dead Sea Scrolls, but they're actually also the scrolls from Jerusalem and the scrolls from Tel Aviv. There was no Tel Aviv then. And the scrolls from Lod, etc. So, coming back to your question, the scrolls of Qumran are a mixed bag, and that should be remembered. They're not the Dead Sea Scrolls. They are the scrolls from the Dead Sea and from the remainder of Israel. So they're more important than you would think from the outset.
Okay, now, Professor Parry, you were going to add something to that, but if you've got it to add, do, but then I want to transition and talk specifically about the Isaiah scroll once you're done. So if you'll do an ad, then I'll serve up the Isaiah question to you.
Okay, my ad is, it's a huge blessing to our community now in the last few generations that so many scrolls were imported to this region that is dry and which naturally help preserve the scrolls versus areas and caves in the near the Sea of Galilee, for example. So it's a blessing, and that helped preserve those scrolls that were imported as people came to the community.
Yeah, just studying the history of literature and how we've got copies of so many texts is replete with stories like that. I'm thinking about the Abbey that had all of those British texts, where they copied all of them and took them to another abbey in France, which was wonderful because 20 years later, their abbey in England was destroyed by Viking raiders and the library burned up. So they had these historical texts that had been moved, and its history is replete with examples. But here's my question. So backstory. South Korea, was going to do an exhibition of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And they, in Korea, oftentimes do things well in advance. And they had committed sales of about $1 million or so in tickets. And then about 7 months out from the exhibition opening, the Israeli Society of Antiquities, or whomever had governing authority over the scrolls in Israel, declared that they didn't think it was safe to ship the scrolls. And so you've got pre-sale, $1 million in tickets, and no scrolls coming. Weston Fields was very concerned about that as one of the sponsors of this. And so he went and found a family based in London. Their last name is Falter, Falter. Wonderful family. And they are what, as a lawyer, I would call a master forger. They call themselves manufacturers of facsimiles. And they were able to access the photographs of the highest quality from the earliest time of the scrolls, recognizing, as Professor Tove said, that the scrolls have deteriorated more in 20 years than they had in 2,000 years before that. And they were able to get the early photographs. They were able to get analysis of the materials. and they were able to make forgery quality reproductions of the Isaiah scroll, the Habakkuk Pesher, a number of different scrolls. And I think there were 7 in total that they made, but they weren't sure that it was going to turn out. Now, understand they were reproducing the linen thread as well as the ink. I mean, these are forgery quality where you've got to stamp them under international law to show that they are replicas and facsimiles. So they produce a set of these that are going to be used to display in Korea. The problem is you never know how the production's going to go. So you don't just make one set, you make some backups. So they made, I think, 9 sets. And the Koreans loved them so much, they said, we'll just buy a set. In Jerusalem, they loved them so much that the Israelis said, we'll buy a set. And that's the Isaiah scroll you actually see if you go to the Dead Sea Scrolls Museum, because the real one's locked up. The Brits bought a set. The French bought a set. And these were sold to these various museums in these various places. But they had one set left. And so we were able to acquire that set. And if you go into the library, that's what you will see for the bulk of what we've got in there. We've got a few other little ditties, but that's certainly the Isaiah scroll. You can see an actual replica of the scroll. And they chose that one because it was maybe the preeminent finding in terms of popularity, at least. So my question for you, Professor Parry, is this. Tell us why the Isaiah scroll is significant. And if anybody wants to go in there and look at it, what should they be looking for?
I think it's the most famous scroll. I might be wrong. The Great Isaiah Scroll, because it's complete. It's 23 feet, 6 inches long. It's 10 inches high. It's made of 17 parchments of skin, and it has 54 columns, not pages. This is before pages. Books were invented. So 54 columns, and the scroll that's on display over there shows the last few columns, including column 54. Columns 1 through 5 or 6 are more worn than the rest of the columns. And here's my theory. The Essenes were like many of us in this group who start reading Isaiah because it's important. And I'm going to tell you how important it is tomorrow. I'm going to give you 5 reasons why everyone should be reading Isaiah. So the first few columns are worn out at the bottom and the top, and then I think they gave up and went back to Genesis and Exodus and so on. I could be wrong. So this materially on column 12, the scroll ripped, and you can see an image on column 12. It ripped almost all the way down, 3/4 the way down, and someone took some linen thread anciently, 2,000 years ago or so, and they threaded it back together. So here's the rip, and then they threaded it, but they threaded it just slightly so it's covering part of one letter of the alphabet. Column 54 has some smudges on it. It's hard to read. And I've worked on the actual scroll, and I've also taken some multispectral images on these scrolls that I'm now working to decipher. The scroll, I'm going to show you some scribal marks tomorrow. The scribes or copyists put some marks in the columns. And that's very important. And Professor Tove has told us what the scribal marks mean. I'm going to tell you a new meaning tomorrow that's just a joke, but I think you'll like it. So materially, and since it's a complete scroll, it dates to about 50 or 100 BCE, before the Common Era or before Christ. That means it's 2,100 years old. So in Luke chapter 4, Jesus went into a synagogue in Nazareth, and had an Isaiah scroll handed to him. I don't know if Jesus asked for it as he went in and said to one of his disciples, I'm going to read from Isaiah. Hand me an Isaiah scroll. I don't know. It could have been an enemy trying to trick Jesus by giving him a difficult text. Now, I'm almost done here. So two of my books.
I'll say something.
Two of my books are on this Isaiah scroll. There's just so much on this. It's written in Hebrew. The scribe or copyist made many errors. Now, some of the scrolls don't have too many errors, but this one has a lot of errors, and I've cataloged them and I've tried to explain. It doesn't take away from Isaiah or his powerful message at all if a scribe made some errors, and we've discussed why did the scribe make some errors. Now, just two items about the contents. The divine name from whence we get the name Lord. The name Lord in small caps appears 6,800 times in the Hebrew Bible. 6,800 times. And that's the divine name Yod-He-Vav-He. I don't know if you pronounce it. I don't remember. But out of respect, I teach my students to say Adonai. It's from whence we get the word Jehovah. 6,800 times. 400 plus times in Isaiah. Each one has a context. Isaiah is packed with the Lord's name. One more quick comment. I actually wanted to take 2 hours. So one more. I've gone through Isaiah and counted how many times we have Jehovah's actual words. Have you ever seen a red letter New Testament where it has Jesus' words in red? I did the same with Isaiah, with Jehovah. And there's his actual spoken words, groups of words, 200 times. So this is a very important scroll. There's more, but I can't just keep talking about it.
No. That's really good. And I think Professor Tove wants to jump in and add to that.
Yes. If you, just to give the audience an idea about what scholarship is all about, you have two persons, you have 3 views. I'm rather split. I'm schizophrenic in my view about the Isaiah scroll. I use the Isaiah scroll all the time, but I'm split in my view about the importance about that scroll. Namely, in my book, that I quoted. I have a book about scribal practices. This is the scroll that I quote most because it's the longest scroll and it's the best attested. I have all these beautiful things. I can see, I know this scribe, or there's actually 2 scribes. I know these scribes the best. I know what he does here. I know what he does there. I know the scribal signs. I know why he messes up this. I know how many mistakes he makes, etc. I know these 2 scribes beautifully. But now when we think about the importance for the biblical scholarship, and Professor Parry has written a book about that, a beautiful commentary on the value, and maybe not here, I'll quiz you later. What is the importance of the readings, the content of this scroll? For what is the bottom line? Now, so you compare the reading, that's called the details. We call that the readings, or we call that the variance of the scroll compared with the traditional text. That's the Masoretic text. Then I say, and maybe you agree, that the traditional text is 99% better than the Isaiah scroll. The Isaiah scroll has millions of mistakes. It has scribal forms. It has linguistic forms that are completely idiosyncratic. I won't go into details. So that's why I say I'm split in my views. And the bottom line, if you're writing a commentary on the Isaiah scroll and you use only what is important for the exegesis, then you'll have little input from this Isaiah scroll.
Okay.
I want to clarify. So I fully agree with Professor Tove that the Masoretic text, 99% or even greater is of more value. I fully agree. And my 500-page book points that out time after time after time. So yes, no disagreement.
Yeah.
The question you're asking, though.
Yeah.
I would probably say that the Great Isaiah Scroll is the quintessential example of Qumran scribal practice. And so if you're interested in a scene, thinking, and interpretation, this is the text you look at. Not because it's the same as the Masoretic text, but it gives you new insights into Second Temple Judaism that are outside the mainstream. So I'm also divided in a way because I see all the mistakes, but it is both, different and because it's different, very important.
Okay. To lighten this up for just a moment, because we will get back into it, the fella went in to see the psychiatrist, and he said, "I'm schizophrenic." The psychiatrist said, "Well, come on in, that makes 4 of us." That's your light moment. But I key it off of your joke that 2 scholars, 3 opinions. I approach it from a non-scholastic basis. And you can disabuse me of what I understand, but I find it fascinating that, first of all, the Isaiah scroll, and when do you date the Isaiah scroll? The great Isaiah scroll?
I think, I don't remember, but it's around 100 BCE.
All right, so you've got a scroll that's 100 BC, and it's got what many scholars would call 1st and 2nd Isaiah in it, which is notable in itself to me to some degree. I'm not saying it's definitive on any point, but it's noticeable. And the second thing is, it looks to me that even though it differs in so many different formative ways from the Masoretic text, it still shows a great similarity of the source material that was used within the Masoretic text. It seems to be from the same source tradition. At least it strikes me that way. It's not, like if you're looking at the book Gospel or the Book of Acts, and you're comparing the Western text to a more normative text, you'll see it comes from a different tradition. But when you look at the Masoretic text, it seems to be traditionally of the same vein, at least, as this 1,000-year previous text. Agree? Or?
Yes.
Agree.
Okay. Do y'all want to add anything else on the Great Isaiah Scroll before we move on?
Well, I would say, if you note this fact that in the year 100 BCE, we have a great similarity between the Masoretic text, basic similarity between the Masoretic text and the content of the Isaiah scroll, that's actually to be expected, because you are in a late stage for the production of the book of Isaiah. You're not in the year 700. So the great differences in, if any, for the production, for the development, for the transmission of the book of Isaiah would have taken place in 700, 600, 500. By the year 100, it was fixed.
It was fixed text. Yeah.
Yes.
That's to me very fascinating.
That way, if you compare with the New Testament, it's children's game, because in the New Testament that's much later, and there the changes are much smaller.
Yeah. Okay, so let's take a step forward now from here. You've got the great Isaiah scroll, but you've also got a host of scrolls that are non-biblical texts, that aren't directly books of the Bible. Maybe that's a correct way to say it. So, Bill, how do the non-biblical texts from the Judean desert inform our understanding of the development of Judaism during this time period? And for our students, at least, we're all throwing in phrases like Second Temple Judaism. Why don't you tell them what you mean when you use that, and then from there, talk about how these non-biblical texts help our understanding of it?
So this is a very exciting time, the Second Temple period. We're talking about the period from the destruction of the First Temple in 586 by the Babylonians until the destruction, and then the rebuilding of this temple somewhere around 515 BCE or BC. And then this temple exists until its destruction by the Romans around 70 CE or AD 70. So that's the Second Temple period, generally speaking. Usually scholars, when they're talking about the Second Temple period, tend to be emphasizing the late stages of this period. They tend to be talking about the 3rd, 2nd, 1st century BC. The really exciting thing about the Dead Sea Scrolls, because of the diversity of the corpus, it's not a sectarian library, as Professor Tove pointed out. It's a library of scrolls that came from all kinds of different places and reflect different Jewish groups. So one of the things that's exciting to me is that in this corpus, you get to see, Professor So said there's, 2 scholars, there's 3 opinions. Well, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, there's a reflection of many different Jewish groups. And the complexity of those different groups, and sometimes the arguing about different groups about what's important. What's the Jewish calendar is like the most obvious, problem. So, and also what's the Bible? I mean, this is what got me excited about this topic is this is the formative period for deciding what the Bible is going to be. So one of the questions we have is, like, when you say the Bible in the Second Temple period, well, whose Bible? Which Jew are you asking? Is the Torah the Bible? That is the Pentateuch, the 5 books. Is the book of Jubilees part of your Bible? Is the book of Enoch part of your Bible? I mean, in the New Testament, it quotes the book of Enoch. In the Ethiopic Christian Church, they have the book of Enoch in their canon. So there are different kinds of Bibles. There are other texts, like the Temple Scroll, that some people might think are part of Scripture. But these are things that are, I think, major topics of debate and discussion. And we're seeing it play out in the quote-unquote Second Temple period. And we have the firsthand evidence. Like, so what did we find when we found the Dead Sea Scrolls? We found the firsthand evidence of this formative time when all these groups are discussing and debating it. They're standardizing the Bible, but they're also copying it and making I don't know if they're mistakes, always.
Yeah.
I think a lot of these variants in Isaiah, they're not mistakes. A lot of them are intentional variations. And that's a very interesting phenomenon.
All right. So we've got about 25 minutes left. And I've got a question that Professor Parry provoked in my brain. And it's one I just want to ask. I'm going to start with you. I'm going to work all the way down. And here it is. Out of the non-biblical texts that were discovered, and you can expand beyond Qumran, and you can go down to Masada or anywhere you want, okay? Out of the non-biblical text, can you pick one that is a favorite and tell us why?
I like a lot of them. I like an awful lot of them. My favorite topic in Qumran studies is biblical interpretation. And that's one of the reasons I got started in this, was interested in early biblical interpretation, formative messianism. The other thing is I like to read texts, and the problem of Qumran texts is so many of them are fragmentary, So I guess the Pesher de Habakkuk is like one of my favorites just because it's relatively complete. It's a commentary on the book of Habakkuk in a special genre. You see a lot of the idiosyncrasies of Qumran Scribal practice, the peculiarities of the sectarian practice of biblical interpretation. So that would probably where I'd go. I like a lot of them, though. It's hard to pick. Community Rule, Damascus Document. I like to read text. I don't like to read fragments. But it's part of the job when you're doing Dead Sea Scrolls.
All right. Professor Tove, do you have a favorite, or can you choose one that is among your favorites and tell us why?
One of the favorites of the non-biblical scrolls. Well, I would say in general the sectarian scrolls, whether I like, it's like if I ask you, I won't ask you, which of your children you love best. I won't ask you.
If you ask my children, everyone will say, he won't say it out loud, but it's me.
Yes. So I won't ask you this question. But I like Bill said, I like the Psharim. Psharim, these are commentaries on the biblical scrolls. I like them. So we have commentaries on some of the prophets, on the Psalms, and they're very interesting and they're idiosyncratic. Basically, they tell us, just like in the New Testament, the New Testament tells you this and this is written in the Hebrew Bible and it all pertains to Jesus. And so these commentaries in Qumran, they tell you this and this is written in the Old Testament, and they all pertain to our leader, who's called the teacher of righteousness, Morea Tzedek. So he is right, because he does what is written in the Hebrew Bible. I like them for the way they portray the Hebrew Bible. I like the Hodayot, the Thanksgiving hymns, because of their religiosity. I like the Manual of Discipline, the community rule, because they give very clear description of the community life, how you have to live. People have compared the life of the Qumran community with life, for one thing, with life in a kolkhoz, but also with life in a kibbutz, how newcomers are accepted, etc. So I like, and there is much in common on a sociological level. So I like that. But
so your one favorite is all of them.
One favorite, like Bill, I prefer the Psharim, the Qumran commentaries on the Hebrew Bible. Yes,
all right.
You're very nice.
All right, Professor Parry.
Thank you for this question, and thanks again for your prayer, where you mentioned the word quicken. I really appreciate that. Like my colleagues, I like all the text. I'm going to narrow it down, though. I like one called The Seductress, which isn't about a woman seducing someone. It's about following, beware of false doctrines. There's another one on the Beatitudes. I really like that one. Both of those came from Cape 4.
That goes in your
They're both parallelistic. They have parallelisms. But I think my favorite is the Temple Scroll. It's a 28-foot-long scroll that was discovered in cave number 11, and it's all about ancient temples. It's very interesting. Several people have translated it, and I have several translations, but I have a 3-volume work by Yiga el-Yadin. So probably the temple scroll, but it's hard to say.
If you want to see we have the great Isaiah scroll that I mentioned there. We also have one of the Pesherim. We have the Habakkuk Pesher, which is a replica as well. And I would jump in and say it's my favorite non-biblical text. And the reason is the scribal practices. So Professor Parry mentioned earlier that there are these 4 Hebrew letters that comprise the name of God. And it's a Yod, and then it's the letter He, and then it's the letter Vav, and then another He. So in English, we could write it as Y or J, and H, and then either a V or a W, and then an H. And it's one that scholars, or not scholars, that good practicing Jews, certainly in the time of Jesus, would not pronounce. It was considered blasphemy to say. You can translate it different ways. A common way to translate it is this idea of just presence, built off the verb to be. So it could be I am or I will be, perhaps. But there's an indication in the Gospel of John that Jesus had used the name of God in reference to before Abraham was, I am. And while we're reading it in Greek, there seems to be an indication that that's what the Hebrew would have been that Jesus may have said. And the people pick up rocks to stone him because he shouldn't. I mean, my first year Hebrew, we learned, the first semester we learned, when you come across that reading a text, you either substitute Adonai, which is just the common word for Lord, or you use the statement Hashem, which means the name, because you don't say it. You don't pronounce it. It doesn't have vocalizations in the biblical text that most of us work with. And so when you go to the Habakkuk Pesher, you've got the name of God there. And they don't, not only would they not say it, they won't even write it in the same way that they wrote it everywhere. So they're writing in this Aramaic script that they had imported from Aram, who had been a mortal enemy for at least the northern Israel for many years, centuries. But they're writing in an Aramaic script until they get to the name of God. And then they will write it in a Paleo-Hebrew script for those 4 letters. They treat it differently than they treat everything else. And it's just really cool. You can see it there. You see it in the Isaiah scroll. Sometimes what they'll do is they'll just put 4 dots in for the 4 letters of the name of God. And I find it profoundly illustrating the doctrines and ideas and practices of them at that time. That'd be my answer. All right, last. Give me your favorite biblical text and why that you find in Qumran and why you find it interesting. No, we're going to start this way, and we're going to work back to you. Professor Parry, you're going first. Biblical text.
Biblical text, you mean book of the Bible?
Yeah, well, yeah, or passage within it. What if we divide buckets up, and now I have to divide my second bucket into 2, but 2 or 3 buckets. One of the buckets is here a biblical text. We have Isaiah.
Biblical text.
Yeah, we have Isaiah. We have a number of different biblical texts in fragmentary form or full form. Do you have a favorite?
The Qumran, there were 21 copies of Isaiah in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Most of them are little pieces now. I would say Isaiah. And just to be clear, the only reason I mentioned the great Isaiah scroll is so significant is because it's the only complete biblical text. But the content of Isaiah, I would say the content of Isaiah is my favorite.
Okay, my favorite biblical text. You require me again to choose between my children. But I'll tell you what the category is. The category is to choose a Dead Sea Scroll, a Qumran scroll, that differs much from the traditional Masoretic text, and in content, in such a way that we get major insights into the history of the biblical book. Such insights have been learned in the books of Jeremiah, in the book of Samuel. Yes, those are the major, well, Joshua. And I choose as my favorite the book of Jeremiah. This would be two little scrolls. They're really fragments. One is called 4Q Jeremiah B. That's 4Q Jeremiah 71. And the other one is called 4Q Jeremiah D. I will explain. The book of Jeremiah is known in a regular version in your Bibles in a long version, and in a short version in the Greek Septuagint, really short, 15% less than what you have in your traditional Bible. Now, this is really a happenstance that we found two little fragments in Qumran with a shorter version of the Hebrew Bible, of chapter 10 and of chapter 42. This is a marvel, and this is a great bonus for biblical scholarship. And it's hard to believe, but it's there. Yes.
Bill, do you want to pick up on that, or do you want me to?
I can't really top that, because I would have said Jeremiah, but I knew Professor Tove was going to say Jeremiah because it's so cool. What goes on, you learn so much. It's such an interesting text. But I'll go in a different direction. My favorite is Qumran's favorite, which is what? The Book of Psalms. My favorite is Qumran's favorite, which is the Book of Psalms. There are more copies of the Book of Psalms.
11Q Psalms, no?
No, the Book of Psalms, the Corpus of Psalms, 11Q Psalms is maybe one example. I mean, we can have a debate about whether that belongs in the collection, but it's the most common book in Qumran. I think it is. That tells you something about how popular it was in Second Temple Judaism. You can read the New Testament. What's the New Testament? The Book of Psalms, you know? So if you want to read something that Jesus and the New Testament disciples and the communities were reading, read the Book of Psalms, because everyone read it, and we have more copies of it than anything else. At Qumran, they use it, they rework it, they're reworking it within the Bible. It's like in Chodaot, you know, it's being appropriated. And
how do you connect Jesus with the Book of Psalms?
The New Testament. I would say the New Testament quotes the Book of Psalms more than anything else. So Jesus' community, that is to say the Jewish community of the Second Temple period, is reading the Book of Psalms more than, and knows the Book of Psalms better than any other text. That's how I connect it.
Yes,
I mean, then there's also, you know, the Messianic issues, which is
there's no connection between Jesus and the Book of Psalms as found at Qumran.
Oh, that's a different question. Yeah, I mean, you're definitely, you know.
Okay, so I go a different direction than all of you on this. My favorite is this small, actually it's two small little fragments from Amos. And Professor Tove knows where I'm going with this, because it's what we have. They're the authentic fragments we've got. And when there was some considerable controversy because it looked like some of the fragments and scrolls at the Museum of the Bible may have been fabrications. And there were some issues about that, and it was being written up by the media, and the media wanted to know why
I published
I thought that ours was not a bogus forgery. And my comment, I said, well, I've got two reasons. They said, okay, what are they? I said, number one, ours has been written up in the Dead Sea Scrolls Journal by none other than Professor Emanuel Tove, who did a study of it and illustrates, and you can go look at the journal, not only the text, but the way the text fits and the way the way the pieces would have fit together with the way this scribe made the letters and the size, and it's got the authenticity and primature of Emanuel Tove. I said, second of all, we do know the history of it and where it came from, and it came from the Wright family, the Kondo family, and so we've got the heritage of it. And I said, and then as a practical third reason, I'm a lawyer. If you're going to make a forgery, and you're going to go to all that trouble, don't you want to forge like the Shema? Don't you want to forge something really, notable that people are going to want to buy? I said, you know what my fragment says? It says, your wife will become a whore in the city and your children will die by the sword. That's not the text that you pick out if you're trying to get someone to pay a lot of money for a forgery. The guy found that more persuasive than anything else.
That's a good one.
Okay. We've got just a few more minutes, and I do want to give each of you a chance to give some closing thoughts. But before I do, where do you land on this issue of forgeries and the idea that a lot of what the Museum of the Bible had collected may or may not be authentic? And because from my perspective, looking at it, I see that some of them probably are not authentic, but I think some of the ones that have been labeled forgery may be very well authentic. I'm not an expert enough to know, but you guys are the closest things we'll have to experts. So give us your thoughts. And Professor Tove, you go last because everybody's just going to really hang on what you say. So we'll start with you guys at the corners. Y'all go first, and then Professor Tove.
I think, I don't have the date in mind, but I think those scrolls that were discovered and cataloged in the 1940s and 50s, I think there's no doubt that they were all genuine. I think those that have come forth since 2000 or 2004 or 5 or 6, I don't even know. But those that were cataloged during those periods, and I've looked at a lot of those scrolls in person. And just a little side note, some very wealthy person flew me to Switzerland to look at 21 scrolls that were in a vault. Or I say scrolls, fragments. 21 fragments. The biggest one was this one, and there's some small ones. They wanted my take on the paleography and what I could see. And I spent about 8 hours, about 7.5 hours, and they brought lunch in. I really took advantage. My wife was out shopping. In about 30 minutes, I was convinced that they were genuine, but I wanted, since a lot of scholars hadn't seen those particular scrolls, I wanted to read them all. So,
There's a story behind that I don't think it's apocryphal. I've got it on good knowledge that one of the scrolls was being offered for sale for $1 million back in the day. I think it was the community scroll, but I may be wrong. And Frank Cross raised the money to go buy it. And he was truly in 1969, the Israeli authorities made it illegal to export antiquities without certain approval or whatever. And that law was coming into effect. And so this was an effort to buy something before the law took effect while you could still export it. And so he takes $1 million and, I mean, truly is going to meet the guy under the bridge in the dead of night, you know, at midnight. And the guy shows up and he doesn't have the community scroll. Instead, he's got a shoebox of fragments and says, you know, I can't sell the community scroll, but nobody knows about these yet. This is our fragments. And Frank Cross said, well, you know, I've raised the money for this. I can't spend the money on something that's not real, and he leaves it alone. And the story goes that the Kondo family that had that shoebox of fragments got it out of Israel before 1969, took it to Switzerland, put it in a bank vault, and it became kind of their IRA or whatever it is. So, you know, when their retirement fund, when they need money, they'd pull something out and they'd sell it. And that is what you saw, or so the story goes. Bill?
You know, I have to say that it's not a topic that really excites me that much. And the reason simply is because I don't think most of the fragments, recent fragments that are either the ones that are in the Museum of the Bible or change anything we really know about the field of biblical scholarship. We don't learn more about the Bible or history of the Bible in significant ways from these little tiny fragments. So then the question is, what's the purpose of the fragment? For the Museum of the Bible, it's kind of like, well, I mean, I find a really good replica does the same thing, which is I'd rather see your replica of the Great Isaiah scroll than your replica of Amos, because I learn and appreciate so much more from that high quality replica. So actually, in a way, if these forgeries are so good that, you know, they pass off as real, then I'm like, that's fine, you know, let's display them. You know, you can say maybe it's a forgery or not. I'm still learning the same amount from this in terms of scribal practice, if obviously, but I'm really interested in what I'm learning from things, and I think the recent fragments that have come up for debate are meh.
All right. Professor Togue, I'm sure you've been asked by a lot of people your view on the authenticity of many of these fragments. What can you tell us? What does your expertise cause you to think?
It's not what is my expertise, and I've not been asked by many people, but I have made certain statements, that's correct. And I've said consistently, I don't know the exact year, but I've said consistently that no proof has been given to disprove that fragments from the Museum of the Bible are fakes. I formulate it in this way. Some doubts have been raised by a very well-known company, but major problems were created when no comparison has been made. What are the criteria for the features of Dead Sea Scrolls? They only raised criteria for the fragments owned by the Museum of the Bible. And incidentally, in parentheses, much politics was involved. And my view was a lonely voice in the desert. Mm-hmm. And I couldn't go any further than that. But much politics were involved. So I say, one should give the criteria for what are the features of scrolls from Qumran, and also from non-Qumran, that is from the sites lower, below Qumran. And I think some of these fragments, most of these fragments from the Museum of the Bible came from sites below Qumran. They were later than Qumran. And when that is being done, and no one is doing a redo of the experiments that have been done, I don't know, 3-4 years ago, then it will be found that probably some, most, or all of these fragments are not fakes. I'm not saying that there are no fakes between them, but some, most of the fragments are not fake. So I go against the major view, and no one knows what's going on. They all follow what the majority is saying, and this goes on in the world.
And as a voice crying in the wilderness, that's where we will leave it. Thank you very much. Would you join me in thanking everybody?